Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening for Impact Music, Media, and Art. Today, we have a special guest, Tip Scarry, actor, writer, singer, and he's going to talk about his new album, Blind Chaperone. Take it away, gentlemen.
Thanks, Allison.
You know, it's fun for me to do these because then I get to act like I don't know anything and hear the stories all over again.
Yeah.
But this whole Impact Music, Media, and Culture series started back about 7 years ago. We had a situation with one of our clients, David, Allison, help me out again. David Porter, legendary songwriter, wrote with Isaac Hayes all the great hits from Stax Records. He, was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it back to LA. I'm a little, under the weather. I'm recovering from surgery. And we're like, well, okay, we'll figure out how to do it virtually. So we put together this program with the LACC at the Herb Alpert program and the songwriters. And so he came in on the screen. We actually had a host in the room. And we did this whole talk and a Q&A and stuff like that. And it turned out great. We posted it online. It went through the roof. And we're like, oh, we can do that again. So that was like the beginning of, talking with artists about their music, the origins of their music, but also how it, once it got out in the world, how it affects people and, the impact of music on people, music education, just kind of whatever the nexus point is once the music gets out into the world. So we have an opportunity to talk about any of that. But this is really a conversation. It's not a traditional interview. We will be silly. We will tell our own stories and we will ping and pong. And I'm really glad to be doing this with my buddy, old pal, Mr. Jason Kramer. Jason and I used to work together at Musicians Institute. And we've had many, many sidebars about, the institution and its pros and its cons. But
needless to say, I quit.
But the point is, we are music educators, and he is a walking encyclopedia. So 20 years at KCRW, 26 years at KCRW. He's a walking encyclopedia of music of all types, and
culture,
and yeah, all the above. So the stories that he tells sometimes eclipse some of mine. So I'm so glad that we are able to do this, and because it's been a while, we haven't done this in a minute, huh, Jay?
Well, it's usually over a bottle of something that we have down below.
Yes, we like to nip while we conversate.
Absolutely, get deep into it.
So one thing that starting at the very beginning last fall when we were introduced by Roger Patton is you're from Connecticut.
I'm from outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
Outside of Boston, so New England.
Lexington, Mass. Home of the Revolution, shot heard around the world, all that good stuff.
My wife was born in Northborough, Southborough versus Eastborough and Westborough, so it's all the boroughs.
You got all the boroughs. I mean, it's such a special place. There's a lot of history, and a lot of that's in the album because a lot of it's about like there's the strains of nostalgia. There's the strains of kind of grappling with distance, born out of moving out here to pursue various creative endeavors and stuff like that. So yeah, it's definitely that's a piece of it. But I love New England.
New England, to me, the concept of New England, I mean, I guess they taught it to us when we were kids, but I missed it, I guess, in reality, because I had the opportunity to go to Scotland, and I got off the plane in Glasgow, got on the bus, and it's taking us down through the countryside. It's like, damn, this looks familiar. This looks familiar. And so I said, oh yeah, New England.
It's just separated by the ocean, but once upon
exactly. The stone fences and the fences with the little cross things, and I was like, wow, this is cool. They just picked their culture up and moved right over.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I had a good time growing up in New England. Did you? I guess the best question I have is, when did you start doing music?
I started playing pretty young. I loved the Marx Brothers, and so I thought I wanted to play the harp because Harpo Marx always,
Yeah.
always played the harp, and he was like the serious musician. We went to a music shop actually in Chicago because that's where my dad was living at the time, and harps are a little more rare and a lot more expensive. And he was like, "Let's start with a guitar because that's like a harp, and then if you really dig that, then maybe jump in the harp." But so that's how I got into the guitar, and liked it, but really started to love it in like fifth grade. Just that age where everything's starting to sort of bubble up, and started writing songs around then. Had some great teachers, one of whom many years later I circled back with and did an EP with before this project, and I learned a ton from him in our initial time together, him teaching me so much about what I know on guitar, and then in the music production side and kind of putting things together in that way. So it was kind of a cool full circle thing. And yeah, he's out in Austin, and yeah, so that's kind of when it started for me. And then in high school, it's funny, I was just talking about this with some friends as we were talking about like live stuff and just getting into projects and stuff. Like I was of an age where people were doing like traditional garage bands, but all that software was starting to come out. One of my best friends growing up, he just had this knack, and he was on top of all these programs as they were coming out, Audacity, like pre-garage band things, Cubase, pre-Ableton. So we were messing with that, and I was playing guitar and some little synths and stuff, and he was programming drums and samples and stuff. We lost TJ over here, but so that was kind of that was a big genesis for me in terms of loving like songwriting, producing, and all that kind of being one thing as like a musical diary entry essentially, which I think the album definitely is for me. It's like I've got this like a collection of seeds and tidbits and everything all scrambled up in there. So yeah, man.
Do you think working with a drama background helps you in kind of creating the structures of your musical works?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think definitely, some songs, I love a triptych, for instance. It's hard not to see the kind of 3-act structure or whatever of so many dramatic works, but I think it also helps. I think a recent thing I found in my writing is like you have a whole history of songs that are so separate from their writer. It's clearly a story. Yellow Submarine, we're telling a story. And then you have, just to keep in the Beatles sphere, like you have those more confessional, this is me songs. And then there's so many subtle gradations in between that. And so I think having the dramatic background and being an actor specifically, to where it's like, yeah, when I tell this story and it's kind of an out there story, in a weird way, that's still me. And when I tell a very me story and it's confessional, it's also still, there's a little bit of a distance. Not a distance, but there's a craft there that allows for a space for a listener to come in. So it's not just me like, pouring my heart and blood out in a way that kind of only assaults the listener. Hopefully it's something where they can see space for themselves in it as well, I think.
No, I completely understand. I mean, the reason I say is because, especially with an acting background and a very creative background, you have artists who are, well, as I'm sure people have said this to you, like David Byrne or Talking Heads, or even Laurie Anderson, where there is a theatrical theme to it, and it kind of puts where everybody's in this box over here doing what they do, and yet you're doing exactly the opposite. But you know what? People look at this. People are more intrigued with this, and if you go through like just the histories of music and see the theatrics of it, it's actually more intriguing and more interesting because that story does come out. Even watching your videos, they're pretty. I call this thing structural chaos.
Oh, I like that. Structural chaos.
It's structural chaos. It reminds me of, as a kid, my mom would say, clean your room. And I'm like, I know where everything is.
Yeah.
Right. It's structural chaos. And I think the creative mind and the creative brain, I mean, I have my Cy Twimbly thing up here, but you look at this, it's the same thing. There's a structural chaos to everything.
Yeah.
That maybe only I understand, or maybe you only understand your thing. And you know, with just as like a sea in the background, you love lines, right?
Mhm.
I shoot photography. I shoot in lines
Yeah.
as well too. And I don't mean like rule of thirds. I meant like where I see lines in certain things. You know, there's an architect that's attached to that. But
Mhm.
that's what's really intriguing to me with your work is pretty much the structural chaos, especially of your videos that you do.
No,
Uh,
thank you, man.
it makes it really theatrical for me, which I love because again, I'm tired of looking in this box all the time.
Mhm.
I want to see something that kind of changes up and is just a little bit fresh, and that's why I'm really intrigued with a lot of what you do and how, and you know, really want to dig in on the background of acting and music and how you found those things together. How'd you put those together? What was the origin of those?
For a while, I was really trying to do this. I was like, keep them separate or whatever. And it's been a big gift to me that just time out here, they've kind of naturally come back together. Just it's just so happened that the kind of various crafts, pieces of acting that I pursued, I was like, well, that actually kind of works well with my music, and parts of the music stuff I started to pursue. It was like, oh, that's actually going to help me, you know. So I'm really grateful that they came back together. Yeah, I think it's funny because if I look at like my favorite musical artists, there are the people who have a more stark artificiality to their theatricality. You know what I mean? And like you mentioned, David Byrne. I feel like Bowie is like such a prime example, and I'm not even well versed enough to dive in on all that. But he's like doing these looks, and it's clearly like a chosen vibe that he's embracing, but it changes. But I think you can also look at artists that we think of as like, oh, authentic to the bone, and that's just like who they are. But really, there's a certain amount of masquerade in that too, and they're just either not conscious of it or just much more subtly conscious of it. Like, I hope people don't realize that I'm not actually a farmer or a biker, part of a biker
Right.
gang or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So it's really fun to me, and I love the whole spectrum. You know, the people who like they seem like they go to bed in that leather jacket, but it's like it's still something you're putting on. And I think what I love too about a slightly more artificial theatricality, if I, to just use that term for one of a better one, it's like there's a moment when you watch something and you know it's fake, you know what I mean? And you're choosing to suspend your disbelief. I mean, people talk about this with like film versus theater all the time, but it's like in a theater situation, we're choosing to suspend disbelief. You know what I mean? We're choosing to take an exercise, and that's kind of empowering as a viewer or a listener. But then that moment where suddenly it becomes real, and it becomes real not in like a sneaky way or a magic trick. It can feel like that, but in an inevitable way. The best example I can give of this, if you'll forgive the diversion, is like I remember watching randomly. You're clicking around late at night, and I stumbled upon this Ian McKellen like he's a young guy and he's doing Shakespeare monologues, right? And it's just on a stage, almost like a one-man show review. The kind of thing that if someone else did it, it'd be so cheesy, and you'd be like, ugh, okay. And he starts reading these monologues, and it's so, at the beginning of it, it's very like he's doing kind of a voice, and he's playing like a woman or an old man, and it's very theatrical. And you're like, well, this is silly. I want raw stuff. You know what I mean? I want to feel. But then a moment happens, and it happened monologue after monologue after monologue. He'd be doing this big bit, and then something would land. And the inevitability and the truth of the fact that there were these words that were written hundreds of years ago, 400 years ago, whatever, and there was a truth to those words at that time, and there was an urgency to those words that made them necessary for this artist to write them down. And they had been transported through time and space to this moment in this actor, but which was, probably recorded 30 years ago. And then now to me, being conveyed to me on my couch, it was like, that's undeniable. Just the truth of that, and that's so, I love that because it kind of gets you despite your best, intentions or whatever.
Well, it's like you said, just even a film itself, you're watching it and it's not real. You got to suspend belief, but at the end of the film, you believe that whatever you just watch is the absolute truth of whatever it is.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm thinking of Erin Brockovich, however you ever say her name right now. Yeah, and you can't handle the truth. And you know what? You become those characters, and you're watching the characters. I'll watch you, and that becomes the whole truth of the whole film at the end. And then that film becomes the absolute truth of whatever the history is, no matter what.
The story just bleeds through. I've had the same. I don't know if this resonates for you guys, but if you've ever had the pleasure of seeing someone in a music setting do the same show 2 nights in a row. Like we saw Florence and the Machine at the Hollywood Bowl. My wife and I love seeing her live. We saw her live, and it was just such a good show. There's got to be some choreography there, but she's so impulsive and beautiful, and her movement and her voice. And we were like, let's come back tomorrow night. So we did. And it was like, it was no less amazing to see what was similar and what was totally different. Because at a certain point, if you have a certain amount of craft and a certain amount of truth to the story you're telling, it transcends all of our cynicism. And to watch cynicism melt away and your heart just kind of get filled up, I mean, that's the best. It's the best.
Well, what's actually really interesting about that is, so those shows are pretty much the same shows night after night, and I've been on tour and seen this, and the musicians before every show, act as if it's the one-off show, and after every show, they're completely exhausted, like it was just the one show. Even if it's a pattern of the same thing every night after night, you still have that.
Yeah, I'm doing a show right now, and it's the exact same thing, Jason. I mean, it's very scripted, very choreographed. We try to find moments to discover new things, obviously, but just listening to some of the other actors in the cast go through these very pretty epic monologues about how we treat each other in the world right now, and some of our history, shared history, whatever it is. And it's like, the onus is on me to hear it fresh every night. That's my job. But I want to do that anyway. And it's amazing that the same words or the same movement can have an impact again and again. It's fun.
There's no
you bring that
show
up.
business. Yeah.
No, that part. But if you're really good at show business, you that's exactly the job, is to take that material and to make it fresh every time.
Yeah.
So what do you find more difficult, music or acting? As far as like the performance aspect of it, because if you're doing a monologue on stage, or you're going back to one every 5 minutes on a set, versus now you have, I'll give an example.
Yeah.
I've interviewed bands, and I've interviewed bands in front of live audiences. I'd much rather do it in front of a live audience, because
tell me, why is that?
I feed off of it.
Yeah.
And just like with teaching, I feed off of it. Last night I did a speaking engagement in front of maybe 100, 150 kids.
Yeah.
And I do a Socratic method of teaching, where I it's back. I mean, me and Thornell are very similar with our Socratic kind of methods of teaching, where it's back and forth questions with the students, and I do that in a live setting. I actually watch like Joel Osteen before I do any interviews, because I find all that church stuff, and I'm not religious, and I'm not even a Christian, but I find that completely fascinating, how engaging that is. And that's an art in itself. And so I will study how they feed off the audience and how the audience responds back. And that's really, it goes back to that Socratic method of teaching. And it also kind of really works role for comedy. Obviously it does. Yeah. And for live interviews, because you could break that third wall to the audience, and the audience is never ready for that. And that's the exciting part, is when you break that wall and that audience becomes really nervous and scared, like an 8th grader going up doing an oral report.
I'm thinking back to what you're saying at the top with the structured chaos, and I think for me, it's not necessarily a medium that's easier or harder. I do agree with you. I do love to have an audience. I guess it's just the ham in me, but it has a structured chaos of its own, because there's this kind of contract of like, you're going to be there, I'm going to be there, but then let's see how we break that. And so that's really exciting, and something that's always very humbling, and I'm always very grateful for. any size of audience is like so fun. But I think also figuring out a way to bring the sort of structured chaos of one's creative home into the job. So if it's a film or if it's a show, in an ideal situation, like, we're shooting a music video, I can bring that structured chaos both through maybe like the set. I've painted the set, or I've chosen the place where we're going to do this. But then also I bring all the internal work of maybe I've rehearsed it, or I've just done some weird exploration. I've gotten weird and trippy and put on some music and tried to surprise myself with a groovy dance move or something, whatever. But to bring all that with me, and the same thing for a show. I mean, in an ideal situation, we're doing, say we do a show at the theater show. We've got a theater down in Culver at the Actors Gang that I'm part of, and it's like that's such a home base for me now. I'm so grateful for that space. But then when we're on the road, maybe walking through every seat in the theater, or sitting in a random seat in the theater and just kind of being a person that you're far from, that you miss. I miss this aunt of mine. I wish she could be here tonight. Yeah. And then you bring in your own sort of emotional structured chaos into that evening so that it is kind of dynamic and buzzing for you, listening to all your favorite tunes. And the same thing with like a music show. And that's great because in that particular case, those are songs I've written. So that's got its own baggage and structured chaos of its own. And yeah, man.
Yeah, but the singing is what's the scary part, because I think the comedy and singing is a lot harder than performing. Performing, you could kind of bend. Singing, you can't really go out of tune. Right. Yeah, so, sure. In comedy, you got to nail that. It's all about timing with that joke. I was just going to go back, like how you said, I know any stage stuff that I've done in the past, I actually will sit in the audience, in a seat in the audience, and look up at the stage.
Yeah.
And visualize myself up there. And what do I look like? Or what will I look like? And I do that as almost as a meditation practice, even though if I'm there for only 10 seconds. It gives me kind of like, okay, this is what they're going to see. Now I need to do this.
And also that way you can then reach them, because when you're up on stage and you look out to that seat, so it just gives you that helps strengthen the connection, which is really important, I think.
Right.
I do have some question. I've had front row seat to your creative process as these songs are already done, but we're still putting the album together. And I love the narrative that these songs were written on a cross-country bike trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. And I posed the question, when you're writing these songs, are you considering the audience, or are you just speaking the truth of the narrative without concern for the audience?
It's a great question. I think it depends on the song to a certain extent, which that's a cop-out answer. I don't like that. Let's
but it does though, because your repertoire is, I don't want to say all over the place, but it's eclectic. So I can appreciate that response.
I think sometimes, if I'm being honest, and I don't want to sound too woo-woo, but in the best case scenario, it feels like I am not the songwriter. It's a song that's coming to me and I'm the first audience member hearing it. Do you know what I mean? So in a lot of cases, and a lot of my art definitely comes from a self-soothing place, for better and for worse. So a lot of times it really is the song that I need to hear to metabolize or regulate something that I'm going through, or to understand something, or simply to take something that feels kind of messed up or unimportant, but that I know deep down is important, and to take a moment and be like, you know what, this is important. I need to hold this. So I think a lot of times it's not about me kind of imposing my will on the song for, I think considering an audience beyond myself, that kind of that's in the crafty part at the end, maybe, when it's like, oh, is it better if I address this verse to like you, or to me, or to her, or to him? There's a little bit of that, what feels more vulnerable versus what feels, what matches the song. If the song is defiant, what feels more defiant. But that's kind of a final touches piece, I think, with the lyrics, and the initial hook or the opening lines to the song, which is usually either starts from the first line of the song, this is a story that's kind of bubbling up, or it's the chorus as like a mantra that I'm just singing to myself to keep myself going or whatever. That usually is something that comes to me and is presented to me almost more like I'm just its first fan.
No. That's not the first time I've heard the songwriting process described in that way. One of the reasons why I wanted to explore that a little bit is that my first introduction to your music was literally through the music video for Occupation Revolution. I was absolutely intrigued by the treatment, how it was done, the chaos of it as it devolves towards the end. But the fact that I work with Billy Porter and he's got a new song out, and he's like, look, protest music has pretty much just evaporated from the airwaves.
Yeah.
I'm trying to bring it back. And Occupation Revolution in its own way is a protest song. And you don't necessarily know unless you kind of zone in on the lyrics and you're like, oh right, they're actually challenging me. Talk a little bit about Occupation Revolution and how it came to you.
Well, that song's really specific because my dad's an anti-war activist, and he wrote that on a poster. It's funny, we've heard a lot of Occupy stuff more recently, but he actually wrote that about the Occupy movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement back in the day. And he loves to make these posters at rallies and stuff. And it was that opening line of, you say you don't want occupation, how about revolution? And I will say, to go back to your previous question, while the lyrics and the song usually is more like something coming to me, the crafting and certainly the production of a song, I am often thinking about my favorite people. It's like, oh, I think my dad would like this surfer guitar lick. I think my friend Ian, does great production as Desktop, I hope he would like this beat. This beat is kind of peppy and almost silly. It's almost challenging you not to laugh at it. I think you'd get a kick out of this. And my wife loves steel drums, so I'm gonna put steel drums on there. Fuck it, it's like. So that is definitely part of the chaos of that song. I think a lot about the Beatles song Revolution. He has these turns of phrase where he goes down a path. He says, "This is what I believe in," and he's like, "But maybe not," And I think for me, that song was about, I guess I struggle with a certain kind of virtue signaling liberalism that I grew up around. And it's like, when people are walking the walk, there's nothing more beautiful. And I not only grew up around it in, a church community, who did do a lot of, beautiful volunteer work and all of that. And then also growing up on protest songs of the 60s and loving Dylan and Lennon and Hendrix and Joni Mitchell. But that was something I grew up on. And so it's like, I think that song in a way is a little bit me wanting to swim in these waters with different heroes of mine, but then also cop to the fact of like, I don't know. I mean, even the name Blind Chaperone, and we've talked about this, it's like, I don't know, don't follow me. I don't know what I'm talking about. And also that, I'm not in a position where I'm trying to start some major overhaul of our systems, you know what I mean? But I do believe in beginning in a personal politics place, starting in your heart. Yeah. And like, if I'm doing right by my heart in here and my most immediate human relationships, that's where I hope to, pick up some trash on your corner every day, as opposed to talk about flying across the world to try to save the world, that kind of thing. So
think global, act local. But
yeah,
on every bumper sticker during the 80s, man.
That part. But it also leads into the 4 agreements, and it's just like, and just putting these things into practice really kind of does shift the energy and shift, our immediate environment. And if everyone was that authentic and committed, then things would actually change.
And by the way, I'm not at all knocking the people who do take those big sweeping stances and put put their shoulder behind it. I mean, that's obviously so commendable. But I think, unfortunately, we live in a time where there's the 1 in a million person who does that. And because they look so sexy, a million other people pretend that they're doing that and give a lot of lip service to pretending to do that. And so I'm not knocking anybody. Again, it's more just it's a looking in the mirror for me of saying, okay, I grew up around these communities. My college too, Oberlin is such a beautiful liberal, has such a beautiful liberal activist tradition. I like looking in the mirror and being like, how much am I a part of this? How much am I participating? And how can I participate more? And what do I need to do, kind of burn off karmically, to allow myself to participate more? You know what I mean? And not be held back.
I gotta say, I'm always intrigued by your insights on stuff. And I was telling somebody the other day, I'll approach something in a very straightforward, okay, it just needs to be blah, blah, blah. And you will take this thing and turn it like this. And it's such a fresh approach and point of view that at a certain point, somebody here who's just trying to get things done, has to let go and let God and let the artist speak. I even just love your response to the question.
Really quickly before we wrap up too, talk about your cover. It's kind of a Where the Wild Things Are meet Goodnight Moon.
Yeah.
Where the Wild Things Are is coming out of this person, which goes back to that religious aspect of in the Garden of Eden. So the Garden of Goodnight Moon is.
I have 2 girls, which is beautiful, and I love reading to them, and I love kids' stories. So I love Where the Wild Things Are, and it's so funny because that's so like on the nose. That with a little bit of Starry Night inspo too. And what's funny is when I was thinking about the cover, and that was, some of these songs, the writing of them is pretty old or whatever, but the cover came together pretty quickly. And I was like, I really wanted to challenge myself not to have an intellectual idea that answered all the questions about the album. I want to challenge myself to do something totally unexpected to myself. And that's kind of where that image of this kind of wolf monster coming out of this quasi businessman or whatever. And then I love the idea of, these paintings are mine, and I love to paint, and I love the idea. My mom used to paint on, she still does paint on wood. So I thought, man, it'd be cool to do it on wood and make it like a face that like the face is popping out. And yeah, so that's what I did. And it drew a draft and then went for it. And I feel like what's fun about it is because it's newer, I haven't had time to analyze it. I think if I look back in a couple years from now, I'll be like, oh my God, that's clearly I was birthing the animal out of my dad, whatever. It's gonna be like so obvious, kind of like we're saying. But right now, I'm just like, oh, isn't it kind of fun? And but yeah, man.
Yeah, it's always dangerous to go back and look at what you've done, especially when you see some clips from high school or college, or your writings from Miss Schulman's 5th grade class, and you thought that was like the best thing in the world. And
yeah,
but needless to say, that's part of where who you become down the road anyway. So.
But Jason, you have it, and you also have to give it up for Miss Schulman for encouraging your giving you the freedom to explore that.
Miss Schulman worked at La Cienega School. I was bused to the inner city schools in the 5th grade, and she was an old white lady that used to stuff Kleenex in her sleeve. Is she alive? Probably not, because she was old then, and I'm sure, who knows, probably didn't need to be embalmed with all those Kleenexes because she's mummified with that. But yeah, I always remembered her and her name for some reason.
We've been at this for a little minute, and for me, it's been exciting to get to know you, get to know your music, to learn more about your creative process. And, I really do believe that this album belongs in the alternative music category. And while this is going to be an introduction to many of the, industry Grammy voters, I think that as they learn more about you and about your music and your musical journey, they're going to be just as intrigued as I am.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about this chapter. of your music. I'm glad I was finally able to get you and Jason together.
Yeah. Thank you, Jason, for taking the time, and thank you, Thornell. This has been great.
Well, let me tell you, Jason was one of the first people who was like, I like this.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. It means a ton, and I appreciate both your artistry, and the reference points are so authentic in what I'm about. So it makes for a fun combo, and it means a lot. So thank you.
You're more than welcome. So we're at our wrap point. You have to go off and be part of the Actors Gang. Jason's going to go off and be even more legendary than he already has. And I guess maybe I'll take a nap.
That's pretty legendary too.
Sometimes it can be. Well,
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. This will be up in a few days.
Awesome. Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
All right. We'll see you.